everyone likes the concept of let's build brand, big equity. We don't care about sales right now. We just want everyone in the world to know who we are, because in the future that's going to lead to ready to convert consumers. But you also do need to worry about cash flow and people converting today, which is why I've got a bit of this centrist view of media buying.
Welcome back to Horizons Podcast, where I sit down with marketing leaders and get them to spill their secrets for the rest of us. I'm your host, Nate Desmond, and today I'm thrilled to be sitting down with Jake Barnett. There's an old quote that goes back probably 200 years ago where a marketer said, "Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half." And the good news is, Jake does know which half. Jake is a marketing data expert, and he's the founder of Day One Data, who's previously led aspects of marketing analytics at companies like Farfetch and Tesco. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nate. Super excited to be here.
I'd love to start with just the very beginning. You've written about, and other people have said, that no attribution model is perfect, but some are actually useful. What makes an attribution model useful or not in your experience?
Yeah, I think it's, the way in which I think about any data product, of which attribution models are that they're data products, they need to be founded on a hypothesis. They need to have the correct data to support it. And really importantly, they need to have the right use cases as well. So whenever we talk about, marketing analytics or marketing data constructs, I always go back to the fact that, these are not independent from data products. This is just like a data solution to a particular problem. And when I think it comes to marketing attribution or MarTech in general, there's so many options that marketers have available between like linear models, U-shape, different conversion windows, first, last click, multi-touch. So I really think there's like a variety of different options out there on the market for marketers to either purchase externally or to actually build in-house. So when you say is there a good model, ultimately no one really knows the truth of marketing attribution. I think that's a fallacy and an aim which is likely improbable at best to understand like the core truth. But what you can do via an attribution model is determine the context of what's happening within a particular scenario, right? Or within a particular period of time. And so when you say that some are more useful than others, those are the ones in my book that are being used on a daily basis. I mean, for example, if your business is very eclectic and you have multiple marketing channels and you're using a last touch methodology, despite a lot of your media being more top of funnel or more brand awareness focused, etc., then you could argue that, that's not fit for purpose within your business context. However, if you've got a D2C brand who just does Google PPC, maybe you could say that last touch is something which is reflective of, how the business operates. So ultimately, to answer your question, I think it's a blend of, the ones that are actually useful are the ones that people are being used because there's some kind of smart, deterministic reason as to why that model is the reflective model that they should be making decisions based on.
If you have, let's say, a CMO who's very strong and creative, but doesn't come from a data background, how would you explain, let's just start with the MMM, a media mix model. How would you explain how a media mix model works and how one should use such a model?
So I think that media mix modeling at the outset is something that all the companies want, but it's not actually applicable for all companies. So that's kind of like a good point to always start on, that before even explaining about what it is it right for you? And there's kind of three levers which I always think about. One is, what's your spend level, right? If you're spending less than maybe like 50 to 100K, there's probably no point in adopting a solution like a marketing mix model. Same thing with your varied media mix. If you're only spending on PPC, you don't need an MMM to determine, truer or fairer attribution. And largely it's around like the data. So do you have enough historical data to inform a statistical model? Do you have clean data as well to inform a statistical model? So within those three, that would kind of typically my first, line of questioning towards a CMO when they're asking about what MMM is. And then to determine what it actually is under the hood. Simply put, it's a statistical model that helps measure incrementality and tell you the truth about the performance of your media spend. And the way in which it does that is slightly different to other methodologies because it's not based upon cookies. So that means it doesn't rely on UTM or directly trackable or clickable channels per se. And then the analogy that I always quite like with marketing mix modeling is that it helps you determine the natural demand for your product or service. So what is like the base? How are you growing year on year? How many people would interact with your product or service without any intervention? And an intervention could be promo or media spend or impact of a new, website and a whole new brand for the business as well. And once you determine that, your brand equity, then you start to place different values and their respective contribution, positive or negative, towards the KPI in question, which is typically sales or return on investment, for example. And then the way in which you use that is to basically help inform decision making, right? When you know the efficacy of those different values, you can start to tailor your media mix or your commercial strategies based upon what's working and what's not. And that's effectively what it's doing.
Now, for anyone who is confused and like, that just sounds like Latin to me, the good news is, if I'm not wrong, you went into your last company, Farfetch, never having heard of media mix modeling, and you came out having run 3 different approaches to managing a $300 million media budget. What got you into dipping your toe into this area initially?
So in Farfetch, where I was for around 5 years, I had a variety of different roles, all within the product space. And then by the end of my time there, I was lumped with this really broad title called Principal Product Manager for Customer Data Foundations, right? So what's included within Customer Data Foundations? Everything really, right? Everything kind of relates to a customer. But this role was very much focused on 2 main sides. So one was around the customer, as kind of maybe, implied through the name. And this was strategies for, personalization, segmentation, trying to get that all important, vision of how can we do real-time personalization for our customers, both on site and through our CRM strategies. But then the other side was all about media effectiveness. So Farfetch had like a $250 million, $300 million media budget. And the job was basically to help infer incrementality. So incrementality is effectively for every pound that you spend, how much you're getting back. It's an efficient or positive incremental impact if you're getting more than that £1 that you spent on media in terms of the return. And the reason why we started thinking, considering about econometrics very simply, is because historically the media budget was more performance driven. So it was probably like an 80% towards performance. So that's your lower funnel channels. And this was a few years ago now, the strategy slightly shifted towards a more of a brand first approach. So this was doing more branded campaigns, out of home, TV adverts, going down much more of like the PR route. So the focus was much more on, holistic creative marketing as opposed to bottom of funnel conversions. And as, a concept, this is obviously amazing, right? Everyone wants, let's build long-term brand equity. More people know about us, more people will convert. However, if you're the CEO or the CFO, you have huge amount of pressure on you to be able to justify the spend of that, the investment of that $250 million. And that's where we started to consider something like MMM, media mix modeling, because it's seen, historically as a very good enterprise level solution for, a number of different businesses who do want to be able to justify and prove the efficacy of that top of funnel media.
That's awesome. And I think this space, what's really important to me is it's not a mystery. It is very understandable, even for someone without a background in data who may not be as smart as you. People can still understand it. And yet, I think too often, especially for a marketer who doesn't have a background in data, it can feel like you're being hit over the head with this information, and you don't know how to respond. You might feel like it's wrong, but you don't know how to respond to it. If, say, there's a marketer who's in a room hearing a MMM report telling them which channels worked, which channels didn't, where they should upweight, what sorts of questions should that marketer bring to the expert to try to better understand the full depth of what the model has done and also how accurate the model may be?
Yeah, I think that's a massive question. But what I would say is that to sort of take a step back, there's multiple ways nowadays of doing an MMM. There's multiple businesses that offer these types of services, right? Trust is kind of the main factor as to why someone would or wouldn't implement, the insights. It kind of went back to your initial question in terms of, you know, which model is actually a good model. And I said it's the ones that are being used. I think the ones that are being used are the ones that are trusted, right? Because you have your traditional consultancies, like very big enterprise players. And why would you trust them? Maybe because they've worked with the world's biggest companies, Farfetch, McDonald's, anything really that would, represent an enterprise. So therefore you get some type of trust because they've helped out these wide scale enterprises. You have media agencies involved who people may or may not trust, right? Sort of marking their own homework. You have different SaaS platforms where the solution is a bit more always on, plug and play, potentially a little bit more black box as well. And then you have, more consultancy style boutiques like us, or you have something like an in-house build where, you're much closer with like what the results are. So typically it starts at the top of the funnel in terms of trusting a model or being able to ask it is what's going into this model? What data points have you considered as features to make this model tick or not tick? So I think that's probably like always a good place to start. And the consultancies will do that, very much hand in hand with you. So they'll be guiding the expertise there. Whereas within a SaaS model, you're a bit more towards your own devices of, what should be included within that model itself. I mean, on the practical level, you also have, you can ask about modeling metrics too, although sometimes that's a bit of a double-edged sword. So within a marketing mix model, typically there's two main data science metrics that you'd consider. One is called R squared, R2, and the other one is mean absolute percentage error. So there are ways to determine, the effectiveness of the model or the model fit, the way it's predicting the KPI through those two KPIs. But what I would say is that they can kind of lead you down a bit of a garden path because you could probably build a model in 10 to 15 minutes and make it fit and make those metrics look fairly handsome, but the model itself could just be crap. So that's why more rigorous testing is needed, especially on the data science side, which I'm probably not in a position to comment on in too much detail. But ultimately, like the main thing that you should do from a model is to basically incrementality test the output. That is kind of the number one rule is if the model gives you some type of recommendation or insight, it would be to do a controlled experiment on, that optimization and to try and validate and prove the relative effectiveness of the decision that the model is telling you to ultimately make.
Well, I love that. So basically, the model is making a recommendation, and instead of just blindly following it, you're saying experiment and see if the model is actually right when you take that advice in the real world. How did you do that at say, Farfetch? Was there an example of something that you learned from a model that was quite helpful?
I would say in the Farfetch context, we probably didn't roll out the MMM program as well as it could have been. But one thing which is kind of a blocker to incrementality testing in general is the need for, well, there's two kind of main blockers, despite it being, the king or queen of, determining, marketing effectiveness. You've kind of got these two main issues. One is the noise within an experiment. So if there's lots of other stuff happening within that testing period, then it's very hard to isolate the impact that your specific test has had. And that was especially true for Farfetch, which at the time was being impacted by macro headwinds, lots of stuff within, Russia, China happening at the time as well, which was also influencing sales behavior. And then the biggest thing is the fact that typically you have to associate it with a holdout test. So typically that means stopping spend on a channel for a certain period of time. And now within like a really competitive business context and really competitive targets to hit and the competitive landscape, if it's a publicly listed company, typically, this is a bit of a generalization, but typically marketers don't love to stop spending money for a certain period of time. And that's kind of like the blocker that we find with, a full scale incrementality testing rollout plan.
And that's actually a really interesting area. So my understanding, which may be wrong, of how an MMM works is it measures the incrementality of variability. So if you have like spend that goes up and goes down, it can measure the impact of that variable spend. But if you have spend that's always on, that falls into what's where you were mentioning earlier, the baseline of what is steady state. And you don't necessarily have a way of measuring the incrementality of the stuff that's in steady state or in baseline. Is that accurate?
I would say that it's slightly different. What you're effectively doing is you're not running an experiment within MMM. So typically it's run on a quarterly basis. Now you can do it on like a biannual basis every 6 months, and you can do on annual. And I think some tools are now offering monthly, but I'm not sure that the business variability is strong enough to actually justify that. But I think it's slightly different to what you said. So what you're bringing into the model, really simplistically, is basically everything. So if we forget about the non-media for a second, what you're bringing it into it is all of your promo spend. You want to know if you've had a new brand design. When did that happen? You want to know if your site went out for a few hours on a particular day. You want to know what events have been run, what spend on PR, who your competitors are. Has there been any pricing changes that we should know about? So it's really, holistic and full scale in terms of all the data that would be associated within a business. And then you can start to bring in even more non-media factors around, inflation rate, seasonality, all of this stuff, right? Which is kind of ascertaining what your SEO, that's another one. I know the SEO people quite like seeing them because it's quite hard for them to measure the effectiveness of the channel. And then on the media side, what you're really looking for is spend. So like the cost associated with the channel, the time, obviously, when things went live, when you spent that. Typically it's by day is cool, by week also works. And then the impressions or the engagement, if it's with a channel like influencers. And when you can't get that specific impression data, for example, an out-of-home campaign, typically the media buying agency will give you like an estimated footfall or an estimated impressions breakdown. So what you're doing is you're looking at that data from the last 2 to 3 years, and you're building your core model off of all of those different data points, split out by time. And that's kind of how it's working. So to answer your question, spend variability can be pretty cool. Spend consistency can be pretty cool. All depends on how they interact, how they relate to the actual KPI. So for example, sales. So what you're not necessarily looking at is like how that, not like an incrementality test. You're not looking at saying like, okay, well, as opposed to 1 month ago, 2 months ago, we spent way less and now we spend this. You're looking at kind of, the overall effectiveness of that spend per channel.
So let's say, and this hopefully doesn't happen very often in the real world, but let's say I'm eerily consistent and every single day, every single minute, I spend $100, and that happens consistently throughout the last 5 years. Is an MMM able to measure the incremental value of that $100 given there's no time when I'm not spending it?
I think there's probably a lot of determining factors. For example, like what is the volume of the spend, and does this actually relate to the KPI itself? So for example, if you spend loads but only 4 times a year, right, during like peak seasonal periods, you could argue that MMM is not a great tool for you because maybe that's typically associated with like promo spend. For example, if you were eerily consistent spending $100, well, $100 wouldn't work. It wouldn't be enough power within the model to get a good read. But if you were eerily consistent and you were doing this for 2 or 3 years and you spent on, 5 or 6 channels, then I think theoretically that would be that would be possible, yeah. But at the same time, potentially it would be worth exploring a different methodology because, I would hope that you would have a pretty good read on, like media effectiveness if you've been doing the exact same thing every day for the last, 2 to 3 years.
Fair. Fair. And before we come to those other tools, because that's an interesting area, I want to think about there are a couple of other areas that came to mind as potential challenges when using an MMM. I just want to bounce these off of you. One is overlap of activities. So you mentioned like price changes, competitor activities. What if I change my price and my competitor changed their landing page on the same day? Would that damage the ability to attribute which one did what?
I think those types of comparison or overlap is not bad. I think that that's actually quite healthy for the model in terms of, explainability of the KPI performance. Muddies the water is when spend is largely associated with a lot of promo. So for example, during like a Black Friday, Q4 period, then it's quite hard to separate like the media effectiveness towards, giving out like some free stuff or discounted products. So I'd say that there's probably not one rule for each, but at the end of the day, there's no 100% perfect solution when you're factoring in so many different features. And what you're trying to do is ultimately create, I mean, it's a pretty cliche term, but they do call MMM a mixture of, art and science. And the art comes from understanding marketing dynamics and working very closely with the internal business team to determine what are the things that make a business work or not work. And if they're saying, we're a super competitor reactive business, and every time they do something, we do something way bigger because that's how we operate. Or on the flip side, we're a super promo driven business. It's that type of kind of metadata that we want to be able to know and input within the model, either through some type of priors if you're using like a more data science solution, or at least just like, potentially some dummy data as well, or just like a greater appreciation of like the market dynamics within the model.
And let's say the MMM comes back and it tells me, like, I'm an e-commerce brand. It tells me, hey, your Black Friday sale is great, but the thing that we think is driving it is the promo, and your ad spend on Black Friday is not nearly as additive. How would you recommend I take in that recommendation, given this is a huge sales opportunity for me? And if it's wrong, that's very consequential.
Yeah, that is a good point. What I would say is that the model will tell you what the model tells you. There's kind of two parts I would say towards, or three parts even towards the model output that you get. So one is you get, explanations, things that are more descriptive on the channel basis, on any business factor that you have and that you care about and you would ask us about. We would potentially create some type of presentation or slide for that specific feature, explaining why performance was what it was. And then everyone's happy with that and it makes sense. You move then into your optimizations, which is more to do with, you know, this is your existing budget. What if you spent it in a much more, if you reallocated that capital towards more profitable channels, this is how that vision could have looked. And if that looks cool, then you run different scenarios like, okay, what happens if actually I 2 times my spend? Or what happens next quarter if I do X, Y, and Z? And you start to, forecast out some of the features of the model, get some assumptions from the business to start build out, this more future looking view or plan. So what I would say is that when you create that plan for them, either for like a Q4 Black Friday, the way in which I always like to think about it is there's kind of confidence intervals, within any model. And I think the job as someone who's external within the business, or even internal, which is potentially more awkward if you build a model and it doesn't work. I think in those scenarios, you give like certain constraints based upon what they did before. So for example, if they spent 100K last Black Friday, you would never create a scenario that's suggesting for them to spend £1 million, in the future Black Friday, just because that's something that, would just conversationally never be operationally feasible or practical. So you work within these different confidence intervals and constraints. And one thing as well is that I don't think there's a scenario whereby a company would blindly follow, the input or insight from the MMM. So typically it'd be, data-driven approach, aka this is what the model is suggesting. It's a hypothesis that you can create through the model. And then it's obviously very good to get the expertise of the internal marketing teams. Plus, if they work with a media agency, one of the big things is that we work very closely with them to see like what's their thoughts, what was the plan that they would have created before the MMM, and you try and make something that is in line with the expectations of the business team, what the data model is suggesting, and what any other third parties like an agency would suggest too.
And the other way this can go wrong is you just have either wrong data in the worst case, or you have missing data. How do you see in the work that you're doing, what are the most common data quality issues you encounter, and how should a CMO think about addressing that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think consistent data and data quality is something which would break any model, right? Not just an MMM. So there's no chance for, like a data-driven approach if you don't have like stable foundations. What I would say, and it goes hand in hand, is that a lot of businesses have marketing data foundations. So that in a really simplistic term means the data from their Meta or Google or TikTok account is flowing directly into some type of central ecosystem, like a data warehouse, right? Which can help to optimize any data model, but specifically a media mix model, because it takes one, a lot less time to actually collect and collate the data. And two, you have the presumption that that data warehouse is governed in a way which means that there's true data accuracy. So I would say that having like a stable data foundations base is really beneficial to a model like marketing mix modeling. Now, in terms of the things that we see inconsistencies are, if you ever spend on offline media, for example, like out of home or TV, you are working with estimated information, like there's no, I don't think so. There's no actual way that people can truly understand the footfall of an out of home campaign, especially if you're running this across multiple locations, or even if it was like a bus campaign. You're seeing so many different people across so many different towns or cities that it's truly hard to understand, the actual eyeballs on that thing. So I think that data is a bit, yeah, up in the air. And then there's probably other data sources which can be provided, which are more proprietary. So you can work with Nielsen to understand like competitor spend data. That can be really beneficial. But yeah, typically internally, I would say the ad accounts, like your Meta spend, your Google spend, that's normally really easy to acquire. The KPI itself, let's say sales, that's obviously pretty easy to get to, or you'd be pretty worried if the business couldn't give you like accurate sales data. So I would say, yeah, that's typically fine. But what I would say is that I think a lot of people think about MMM largely in like a D2C context, or at least like a D2C omni-channel context. But where it gets maybe somewhat trickier is when you start thinking about MMM within the B2B context, because you might have to start looking into data around like SDRs or AEs. The conversion funnel is way longer, so it's very hard for them to say like how a SQL MQL actually relates to a conversion. So it's these types of things where I would say it's pretty consistent and easy within the D2C context, but the B2B side is where I think that, those CMOs definitely do struggle for those more like long sales cycle considered purchases.
If a sales cycle, just going on the B2B piece for a minute, if a sales cycle is consistently long, are you able to just time shift and then the model still works? And if it's inconsistently long, that you encounter more issues?
I think that like internal teams and consultancies need to be pretty transparent about when an MMM should or should not be used. And it really is such a data answer, but it really does depend, because if your business has a average order value of $1 million and you make, 10 sales a year, probably there's no point in doing like an MMM. Maybe just do like a survey on post purchase, something like that. But what we're seeing a lot of nowadays is that more SaaS platforms are actually adopting kind of similar tactics to what like a D2C business would use, maybe slightly more like event and account based. However, yeah, there's obviously ways to determine it, but the data quality can be a little bit trickier, largely because of the impact of sales cycles, and also because, as I mentioned, like the actual sales team, which I guess it depends where you come from, if you want to consider them a marketing cost or not. But obviously it just makes understanding, where a specific sale comes from throughout the funnel much trickier to ascertain.
It does. And it's interesting as you say that, it struck me that an MMM is probably a better fit for a business that has a similar size average order value versus often in a B2B context. Pareto principle applies, and you have the outlier that drives 80% of your revenue, and then a whole bunch of people who drive a small amount. In that case, an MMM is probably going to be a lot trickier to actually use.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you actually just think about what it's doing, it's kind of telling you where to reallocate capital and how much you should spend to drive conversions, at like its base. And if you know that already through whatever tactics that you employ, or if you don't do any marketing, then you couldn't feasibly, but you don't need to use, something as sophisticated potentially as a marketing mix model. So I think it's always that balance between like, what is your actual use case? Is it going to embed in your reforecasting, forecasting, QBR, budget planning processes, or is it just a nice to have to determine, you know, what's going on under the hood of my spend? So hopefully the former.
And let's say you're a marketer at a e-commerce company. It is a good fit for MMM, but there are a million things happening. You have a small team and everything's calling for your attention. Let's say you don't yet have a MMM system or even a central place of tracking all of this data. How would you weigh the opportunity of building out data tracking and then doing an MMM or some other similar thing versus like, I need to go run this campaign tomorrow. I have all these other pressing things that will hopefully drive direct value for the business.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the MMM would drive direct value at some point, but typically the conversation goes by those kind of eligibility criteria that I asked you before. And presuming you are eligible, the next question is typically, have you run an incrementality test? And if you haven't ever run an incrementality test, that's a pretty good place to start. It's the gold standard of measurement. And typically we say to companies, give that a go. If you don't have the resources to run an incrementality test, then it's going to be unlikely you're going to be able to validate, the MMM output as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. It really depends on like the channel mix. If they're going really big on, if they're a D2C company that has an omni-channel presence and they're spending on influencer, out of home, Meta, Google, and retail media as well, sponsoring an aisle in a supermarket, they're probably thinking so much of our spend is going towards the top of the funnel here, or offline media. There is literally no way for us to do some type of software plugin like a triple whale, etc., to determine the efficacy of all our advertising behavior. However, we can see that our brand is growing and we want to grow even more. So we want to do more of what's good and less of what's not so good. Then it's a great solution. And one of the things that, this is not meant to be salesy at all, but I think one of the reasons why companies do pick a consultancy as opposed to maybe like a software or building in-house is because of what you just mentioned there. They're so busy and there's a million priorities. They really want to know how much they should spend on marketing, but there's obviously loads of other stuff they need to focus on internally as well. So they do opt for, third parties who not only set everything up for them, but also will interpret the results and kind of be a bit more prescriptive in terms of do X, Y, and Z. And we think you get ABC in terms of the output.
Is such a benefit, not just in this area, but in so many areas. Having someone who's the expert who can come in and shortcut 2 years of learning it yourself is so powerful. And you had an interesting experience at Farfetch where you did three things at once, if I understood correctly. You had an external consultancy, you did it internally, and you also hired a SaaS operation to run an MMM. What was your takeaway from doing three at once? Would you recommend other people do all three at the same time?
No, definitely don't. do that. Well, I think that the issue with really big enterprises is that they operate in a lot of markets. So, I think there was more than 10 top markets in the Farfetch ecosystem, which had spend with more than, $1 million, $2 million in each of those markets. So therefore, you are really interested in the results per market. But the way that MMM works is that you do need to do a distinct model per market. So that's why in that scenario, it wasn't a crazy decision to have this three-pronged approach because they did want to make sure that, all the markets were covered from the measurement perspective. So the strategy was, let's do big consultancy, which was cost a lot of money, like $500,000 a year for, the biggest market, which was the US at the time. Let's use the SaaS model, which is a little bit more plug and play and obviously a lot cheaper for some of the smaller markets. And then overall, let's maybe get rid of all of these things in a few years because we've got our own internal model, which is really great. And we can just, man this in-house. So that was kind of, the strategic approach. I think, look, we did this must have been, a few years ago now. And I don't think that the in-house build market was as mature in terms of like the amount of statisticians or econometricians or data scientists who were around necessarily, or without like the right resourcing to do so. Although I do think that has changed a lot now. And then I think, yeah, I mean, to be honest, the business was going through an interesting time towards the end of it. So everything kind of got saturated in a.
And you've been across, not just at Farfetch, but in your consultancy, a lot of different MMMs. I'm very curious, what are the unexpected findings, not for individual ones, but at scale that you see come out of it? Like, do competitor prices matter a lot? Does competitor spend level matter tremendously? What are the unexpected drivers of marketing success?
Yeah, good question. I mean, let me have a think about this one. See the latest results that we've produced. I don't think anything's particularly crazy, to be honest with you, in my understanding. Like NPD, new product development, is always a super incremental move for businesses. Competitors are always a detractor. Offline media is probably something which is a surprise to a degree because, you just can't measure the ROI on that activity. So when you do see it, you are like, okay, that's cool. So I don't think there's anything which is probably, if you see anything which doesn't make sense to you or I without considering the results, then you can kind of say that there's maybe a problem within the model. It's more about like how much is that ROI, because you're trying to balance that brand v performance spend or balance that spend between other digital channels. So I don't think there's anything that's particularly crazy. I mean, one thing which is always pretty useful to see, especially for omni-channel businesses, is the halo effect from retail to wholesale. So you're always looking at, if I do have my product in, I don't know if you get like a Boots or a Sainsbury's in Singapore, what impact does that actually have on like our D2C subscription? So those types of insights are always pretty interesting. But apart from that, maybe I'm just numb to it. But yeah, we typically see the offline media like out of home, even events, PR, always typically having pretty strong ROI, which otherwise wouldn't be seen through attribution modeling.
That is actually fascinating. Three areas there that stuck out to me. One is when you look at like being in a physical store, let's say you're a D2C brand, how big is the impact on online sales from being present in like a Target or a Boots or a physical store?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say and generalize for every brand, but typically a very short answer is we see, pretty good halo effect. And then you kind of want to look out for cannibalization as well. So it's hard to run a D2C brand. Everything that you do, has positive and negative impact. But yeah, the way that I kind of always think about it is that having your product or service in a target, or not service, but having your product in a target, is kind of an advertising move for D2C anyway. So if you do have a kind of quasi business model whereby you can buy individual and also subscription, I think, having your product in a physical location is pretty cool for your bottom line.
Would you go so far as treating something like that as an advertising channel where you don't expect to make much, if anything, from being in the physical store, but you primarily consider it to be about building your brand?
From the model itself, no, I don't think that's something that you would, put within the model. From my experience of working with, scale up style, omni-channel businesses, I would say definitely that's a consideration for all of them. The more that people can get people to see their product in a physical location, the more likely they are to go online and buy that thing once at home. And that's, I'm not a pure marketer, I'm more on the data side, but that is a large part of the marketing funnel, right? Is how you can actually get and target people from all walks of life, if that's your target demographic, and how you can get them at each stage of their funnel. So, if there's an impulse purchase within a store, how do you later target that same person through advertising to make sure that they come and shop again and again and again?
One of the things I find so fascinating in business, just to sidetrack for a minute, is how important the business model is. That I've not worked in this area of D2C, but if I came in as a company and I just looked at it as a consumer, it's like, hey, I want to be in the stores to sell and make money through the stores, and I'm competing with a company that views it as an advertising channel, I'm never going to be able to succeed if they're willing to take such a small margin because this is an advertising channel for them and they're making their real money elsewhere. So it's fascinating how much the business model matters tremendously.
Yeah, massively so. And also it depends on, the margin that you make from the product. Like if the CAC, so the cost of acquiring the customer, is different from, wholesale to D2C, what the commercial agreement is with the wholesaler or the retailer, So all of these things play into it. And yeah, I'm pretty happy that I don't run a D2C brand.
That is an intense space. I want to think about the competitor spend also, because you mentioned that as an area that does show up in MMMs. How consequential is competitor spend? Like, let's say I'm running a company and I see that my competitors started to spend a lot more money. Should I be very worried or just a little bit worried?
I feel like I'm just giving you lots of it depends, but I really do think it depends on the industry, and your sort of like brand equity within there. For example, if you are a business that's been operating for 250 years, clearly have market share, I think the relative impact of competitor spend is probably quite light. Whereas on the flip side, if you're in quite an emerging industry with lots of competitors doing like fairly similar things, and the impact is going to be rather large. From the competitor standpoint, we wouldn't just look into their spend. We can look into like the share of search. So that's also data that we can get from third party sources, and also their like Google trend data. So how much people are like looking for that brand, typing it into Google, or even like the generic search term, not even just a brand. So all these things will have like a fairly massive impact. I mean, the as a percentage of revenue decline through competitor, I mean, typically you can see anywhere between like 10 to 20% or something along those lines as well. But that's a bit of a generalization just based upon some of the clients that we've supported. But yeah, I would say that competitor is typically one of the biggest detractors from revenue within or as viewed within a model.
That is interesting. And it reminds me how important it is to spend when it's the right time to spend. Because you can imagine, on the one hand, a company that's really established, has market share and established market, competitor spend doesn't matter so much, which means you should spend when the market is still developing, because later on you spend the same amount, you won't get nearly as much results.
Yeah. No, and that is a crucial. So they call it like the spend laydown. That's within like modeling terms, what you'd call spend phasing, which is effectively just what you said. Like when to spend on a certain channel or activity. And through the historical data, you obviously you can see the spending patterns. You made that reference before, like what happens if I spent the exact same every single day, which is potentially a bit unlikely. But you understand those spending those patterns, and that's called your spend phasing or your spend laydown. And what you would look to do within your results, if possible, not always possible, is not only to say this is how much you should spend and this is what you should be spending on, but also when you should be spending that. Because in a really simplistic term, different media has different lagged impacts. So for example, if you run a TV campaign, you might not expect someone to convert watch the TV campaign and be like, oh my God, I'm going to go online right now and buy that thing, but potentially a TV campaign will give them, the incentive to go and buy something, and then they'll get targeted by Google or Meta ad in 2 weeks' time, and then actually go down the conversion funnel and purchase something. So the lagged effect of media is really crucial, and that's something as well that, if possible, depending on quality of data and performance of the model, that is something that you can look to bring into the recommendations too.
And that brings me to another area that is top of mind for every marketer: brand spend versus performance spend. When you see brand campaigns, like something that's not intended for performance, it's above the line ATL, what is the decay of that impact generally? Is it something that truly does, as we hope it does, continue to have an impact for many, many months or years? Or is it something that really it decays quite rapidly in the weeks following the end of the campaign?
It's hard to put, like a quantified period of time or an average period of time onto it. But what I would say is that I have a bit more of a centrist view to brand v performance spend. And I think both are really important within a media mix. And ultimately, even as a founder myself, I couldn't ever imagine doing anything from the pure brand perspective where I didn't want that to convert at some point, right? So I always think that although, your goal of that campaign is maybe awareness, the next phase of awareness is hopefully some type of interest for them to potentially convert. What you can do within MMM is not only determine the short-term ROI, but it's also the long-term ROI between, the impact of media or the activity. What I would say though is that the longer the time period that you're trying to determine the ROI of, the less accurate, that read becomes. So that's also partly a reason why MMM is run on a quarterly basis, because you're taking into account 3 months of data as well. Yeah, so you hopefully within the next run, so Q2, you should get the lagged effect from some of the, activities from the previous months as well.
Fair. And it reminds me, there's something you shared on LinkedIn that I thought was a really good way of putting brand versus performance. That I think you said performance is often borrowing demand from the future, you're shifting demand forward, whereas brand is often building demand and it's building into the future, which can cause maybe an overinvestment in performance and an underinvestment in brand. It's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I definitely didn't create that sentence. I don't know where I got that from, but thank you to whoever did. But I think within the same tone, everyone likes the concept of let's build brand, big equity. We don't care about sales right now. We just want everyone in the world to know about who we are, because in the future that's going to lead to, you know, really, really sort of like ready to convert consumers. But you also do need to worry about cash flow and, people converting today, which is why, I sort of said that I've got a bit of this centrist view of media buying, because I do actually genuinely believe that both is really impactful. And I think what I was seeing within my time at Farfetch was that there was a bit of an acknowledgement that the more traditional media, for example, out of home or more brand spend, was maybe just for the big companies. But what I'm seeing now is that a lot of the scale ups are adopting a much more mixed approach to their media as well, and really focusing on, organic brand building, brand equity, at least for the first part, especially, with the rise of like the marketing and UGC as well. It's much easier to produce, organic branded style content, especially as I think the landscape is changing so much, as it's getting more expensive now to purchase like performance channels with all like the LLMs as well. People are a little bit unsure with, what's the future of this going to be in terms of media buying. So yeah, I do definitely see that these maybe more contemporary, newer businesses are focusing slightly more on that sort of brand organic piece rather than just pure play performance. Performance is still obviously really useful for lots of businesses who are trying to make money.
And speaking of guerrilla marketing, because this is such a fun area where you can find something new that could really explode the business in a way that is hopefully cheaper than some of the more established things. There was a company years ago when I lived in San Francisco where I think the founder and a few other people would stand outside of the subway stops in downtown San Francisco and hand out flyers to the people walking by that gave them like a 10% discount to use their meal service, which was a great idea. It was exactly in the place where people are interested in being early adopters. It was a broad appeal. Everyone could buy a meal. And I think it worked really well when you look at the cost for printing and the cost of standing there. They probably got a really good ROI on that, but it doesn't necessarily scale so well and it doesn't work for every business. What are some of the coolest guerrilla marketing things that you've seen that were impactful, maybe at some of these scale ups?
Yeah, it's not something that I can say confidently that we've measured, but one of our clients is a brand called Perfect 10. They are a big matcha business. And there's a big festival in the UK called the London Coffee Festival. I think it's like over a few days based upon in East London. And from the previous years, they've always gone there and exhibited and had a stand and, sort of played the game within the London Coffee Festival confines. This year, they didn't get a stand. However, they still went with a big flag that was like London Coffee Festival with the coffee, stroke through with matcha replacing it. And the whole concept was, like this is not about coffee anymore. This is about matcha. So that was something that, a client that we work with who have done pretty well through these like guerrilla tactics.
I love that. I love that. Okay, so we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about the technical side of MMMs and other measurement methodologies. I want to talk about the human side because you've written, and I completely agree. I think you said 70% of digital marketing transformation is about managing change, not just implementing solutions. What are the most common mistakes that people make when they try to dive into media modeling without thinking through the human side?
I think at the outset, people are quite anxious just about trusting a data solution, like no one just looks at the output from a model and then kind of dedicate their whole media budget to the insights that are created from either this random guy or this random technology that's being created, specifically for them or not even specifically for them. So I think there's a lot of hesitation, right? Which is cool, which is good. I think there needs to be. And in terms of, the problems that you face, this is one from like the Farfetch ecosystem, but your MM is kind of creating an MMM attribution, right? It's not sort of pure always on attribution, but it's like a form of, more reflective attribution. But the way in which the business operates on a daily basis is likely using a different attribution methodology, something like last touch or multi-touch, right? And therefore, the business targets that are being set, especially for marketing revenue or marketing return on ad spend, is set from a different attribution logic. So what you're trying to do is you're saying, I don't care about your specific channel ROAS. I care about like holistically how this business is going to make the most ROI. And that can lead to tricky conversations, right? Because you're effectively asking a internal marketing person or the agency to potentially not hit their targets in favor of a more holistic, measurement and recommendation solution. So I think this is where you typically get quite a lot of obstacle or friction to implementing the results, which is kind of a cultural piece in a way, because even though you're saying this is the truth, go and do it for X, Y, and Z reason, there's still other methodologies internally which are conflicting and competing with that output and those results, which make people hesitant for, the performance of their own area. So I think that's kind of, one angle of looking at it is like conflicting attribution methodologies. And then I think the biggest one that we probably face time and time again with these businesses is that it's the cadence and frequency. So there's kind of like a very typical thing. It's called the triangulation of marketing effectiveness, where it's like you have your always on attribution model, aka your multi-touch or first touch. You have your multi-mix model, which is kind of a quarterly view. And then you have your incrementality testing as well. And the biggest issue with, I guess, adopting MMM insights is that you get them once a quarter, right? So that kind of means you're limited in a way towards the use cases, right? So you could do quarterly, budget planning, or you could do like big forecasting, like on an annual basis. But what you're probably not doing through your MMM is super niche, super specific, creative measurement or everyday budget shifts as well. So I think this is kind of where it gets a little bit tricky, whereby you still do need a alternative attribution approach more for that kind of like daily or weekly reallocation.
That's fair. That's fair. If you were, let's say, a marketer who wants to do this and you're excited to do it and you're willing to say, I might not hit my quarterly targets next quarter, who would you generally expect within the broader organization would be a champion of that and be willing to give you that air cover to be able to actually do such a thing?
I mean, when you work with the enterprises, you're not really working with C-suite per se. You're working with kind of like heads of slash VPs. And typically there's like different people, you'll have like a VP of demand generation and you need them on site. But then you also have the marketing managers as well, who are much more clued up about like the actual channel dynamics. So, you know, you could then on the flip side, within a scale up, you're probably operating with the CMO or CEO, right? Because you're telling them how to spend their money. It's much more personal per se. Regardless, I think there's shared themes in that you need to kind of adopt a top-down approach. If the exec or the leaders in question are very much so in line with what the recommendations are and believe in it, then they can, have that autonomy to set that top line, budget, which will then be filtered into the relative various teams to be able to go and spend on that, more granular level, or at least give them saying like, this is your budget for the next quarter. Now you can use your alternative methodologies to, optimize that spend towards the specific channels or activities. But hopefully what they're doing is appreciating the power of the MMM and asking the in-house team or consultancy or agency or whatever, if I did X, Y, and Z, and this is a new activity, would the model be able to measure this approach? So you've kind of got this 360 view of get the leadership buy-in. They say, this is your quarterly budget. The more people close to the ground are actually implementing it and working with the consultancy agency or in-house to make sure that the spend is something which will be able to be measured.
In this decision-making process, stories matter so much, visualization matters so much to helping us as humans understand numbers, which we're very bad at understanding as humans. How do you think about storytelling and visualization of the outputs of an MMM, an incrementality test, or even just attribution?
Look, I think it's so crucial. I mean, as a data person, I've spent so much of my career building out dashboards for, different stakeholders. And typically everyone wants a dashboard, but they don't necessarily need a dashboard. There's probably a lot of wasted dashboards out there in the ecosystem. I think most data people, especially analytics engineers or BI people can attest to that, to be honest with you. But what I would say in MMM is that the results just need to be clear. Typically a consultancy will present that back within like a presentation, a long presentation, and it can get a little bit, you try your best to make sure it's not boring because you might be covering lots of different topics, right? Like demand generation, brand media, which might, encompass lots of different teams as well. So maybe like that bit is the most relative for them. So what you try and do is to break down and, segment your insights for the teams who are relevant, and then have some type of executive summary for your CMO or VP of marketing, etc. So that's kind of like one. And then what a lot of consultancies and agencies do is create, these self-serve tools so that the marketing teams can scenario plan and optimize without needing, the third party there. And that's kind of something which the SaaS platforms obviously have just like built in and ingrained. And that's something which, the traditional consultancies do have, but they're maybe a little bit slower or clunky or Excel based. And that's actually something that we're trying to kind of disrupt somewhat.
Yeah, that's a good point. The usability is really, really important when it comes. Are you making decisions with this, or is it just an interesting report that sits on a shelf?
Yeah, exactly. I think you want a bit of both. Ultimately, you want to give someone trust and confidence that what I've put into this tool for you to optimize is accurate. And the reason why is because I'm going to explain this through a 50 slide deck. But also, here's the tool. You don't need me now to go and interact with the model.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exciting. The one last thing I want to touch on is incrementality testing, because this is, as you said, the gold standard for measuring things, but it's also somewhat complicated if someone has not done it before. How would you explain what a good incrementality test looks like for someone who maybe has never seen one?
Good incrementality test is one where there's a conclusive, a conclusive result, I would say. I mean, incrementality testing is quite a broad approach, right? Within incrementality testing, there's A/B testing, causal impact, differences of differences, geo testing. So there's lots of different methodologies, within that kind of umbrella term. Whether this is like the good way of doing it, I don't know. But, ultimately to do a test, as I kind of mentioned previously, you need buy-in for the test. So something needs to change. You need to target either a different user group that's not in one geo or locale. You need to either, hold out spend, you need to spend loads more. There needs to be some type of change or shift in intervention, right? Or even strategy or creative. Something needs to be different. So you need buy-in from the business to be able to get to that point. So typically what we would do is do some type of pre-testing, power analysis, which would mean to basically say, we have this confidence that this test is going to get a conclusive result if you hold out this much spend in this location for this period of time, right? So that's kind of what we would say is like your perfect pre-testing approach. Your test design needs to be really consistent and based upon humans or channels or markets, which are also going to be consistent, right? Without noise. And then the end of the funnel is basically like the test analysis, which, is the kind of simple bit, hopefully, which is where you're basically drawing conclusions as to, what you've seen within the test. So yeah, I'd say all in all, it's about picking the methodology which works for you. And you're seeing a lot more sort of geo holdout tests nowadays, especially with the lack of, UTMs or sort of like directly trackable cookies, which is also why you're seeing a lot more businesses invest in first party data as well to store this internally. Um, and even, I'm very pro testing. Like, even if you see an inconclusive result, there's still conclusions for me that you can draw from that. If, for example, you say that a 5% uplift on this either way or decline will lead to some type of conclusion and you don't have statistical significance, therefore, your thing is obviously not doing 5% positive or negative. So nothing's really changing, So yeah, I'm protesting for sure.
And if you were someone getting into this for the first time with maybe a hint of a technical ability, but mostly not, would you recommend, like, let's take geotesting? Would you recommend they learn causal impact, they do a bit of Python, maybe they have AI to help them along the way? Or should they just go find an agency or hire a person who already knows this?
I think that, the best methodologies are the ones that people understand them in the most detail, for sure. But nowadays, I think it's pretty tooled up. There's platforms like Measured, House, there's loads of these different third-party softwares which kind of all do, in my opinion, similar things. So, I think that's probably like a good place to start. And especially if you're not, it depends on the size of the business. If you're not spending like hundreds of millions, in which case I'd expect someone to probably be fairly mature in terms of like testing frameworks, then I think it's relatively cheap to use these platforms.
Love that. I feel like it is often scary to get into this sort of thing, but it doesn't need to be. It's actually not nearly as hard as it sounds. You throw out terms like
Yeah.
incrementality and it's like, well, this is scary, but actually you just do it and then you know how to do it and it's easier than you thought. The joke I always make about the things I commit to do is this old John F. Kennedy quote from the US. It's like, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they matter, something like that. And I love the twist on it, which is we do these things not because they're easy, but because at the time we thought they would be, which is kind of true. But you just have to jump in and it's hard for a bit. And then you come out the other side and you now know how to do an incrementality.
100%. And like, the best incrementality testing frameworks and programs that I've been a part of are the ones that are consistent and there's a roadmap, and it's just about churning them again and again and again with a testing learn culture. So yeah, totally agree. Like, the more you do something, the more you're gonna, know how to do it.
I love it. Well, that brings us to the end of the interview. I've learned a lot. Thank you for doing this. Before we conclude, I have a lightning round. So I'm going to throw out a couple of quick this or that questions. and just get your gut reaction. Marketing mix modeling or multi-touch attribution. Quarterly planning or weekly optimization.
Both.
Geotesting or A/B experiment.
Geotesting.
Real-time dashboard or quarterly report.
Real-time dashboard.
AI-powered attribution or statistical modeling.
Statistical modeling for now.
Transparent models or black box solutions.
Transparent.
I love it. Well, thank you. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Day1data.co. Yeah, reach us there. We're actually getting a new website. We're also launching a new product to help in-house teams who are building MMM help to optimize the spend. It's going to act as a bit of a plug-in for the marketing and finance teams. So if there are any in-house MMM builders out there who are thinking, how can we make sure that our model is operationalized within the business? How do I make sure that I'm not a consultant towards the rest of the business? Feel free to reach out. Let me know. We can take you through a demo of this new platform we're creating.
Love it. All of that will be in the show notes or down below if you're on YouTube. Jake, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.